Hey guys, Chelsea here from Making Manzanita, and today we're going to be walking you through a few things that you need to know about wet tile saws. So if you're watching this video, you're probably either one, thinking of buying a new wet tile saw, or two, you're thinking about trying to do your very first tile project as a DIYer. And if that's the case, welcome to our channel. We're glad you're here and you can totally do this. So we're going to walk you through a few things that you need to watch out for when using a wet tile saw, how to change out a blade, what a wet tile saw is, and a few other things. The tile saw that we're using in this video is one that we got at Harbor Freight a few years back, and unfortunately it is no longer sold. So I can't give you the link to the exact saw that we're using. I do see that someone is selling it on eBay right now, like a used version of it. So I will link to that in the video description. But as a replacement, Harbor Freight has come out with another type of tile saw that looks almost exactly similar to this. It's just under a new brand. So here's a little closer look at the saw that I was mentioning. It's under the Diamondback brand, and it is a 10-inch wet tile saw with a sliding table, just like we have. And the specs on this are very similar to the Harbor Freight one that we have, made by Chicago Electric Power Tools. So Chicago Electric is actually, they've discontinued that line of our tile saw, and this is, it looks like another line that probably replaced it under Harbor Freight's tools. So this one is $529 right now. Pretty similar to the price we paid for ours. I think we paid about $400 to $500 for ours, and that, again, that was a few years ago. Here's a little closer look at the specs for this, and again, I've compared it to the one we have. Very similar. Looks like it's pretty similar to the one we have, which is this one. And let's jump in and just take a little closer look at the actual tile saw. So one thing to keep in mind, if you're wondering what a tile saw is and why you need water when you're cutting tile, so the water on the tile saw will actually allow the tile and the blade to stay cool while you're cutting tile. And since the blade has to do a lot of work to cut through something hard and dense like tile, there's a lot of friction that occurs. And without the water, the blade will have a tendency to heat up and actually begin to smoke. So that's why we recommend using a wet tile saw when you're going to be cutting tiles. And this is a little closer look at ours. Here is the basin that the water goes into, and we are using this tile saw outside. And if you have the ability to use your tile saw outside, it's much better. Using it inside requires a lot of extra work to prep the area because it gets pretty messy. So if the weather permits, always try to use your tile saw outside. We just have it set up here in our front yard and just ran an extension cord over to it and put it on a table. So once you get your basin filled up, you want to, just as Logan's doing here, run the sliding table through while the saw is moving, and just make sure that it can move nice and easily through there. The tile saw can get kind of messy. You can see there's quite a bit of gunk in our table. It wasn't cleaned out properly the last time we used it. So the blade is not moving through that table like it should be. You want to be sure it's nice and smooth and nothing is preventing that table from moving through the saw. So we're going to clean that up. But here's a little closer look at one of the things that I love about this tile saw and the one that has replaced it is the ability to cut at angles. So you can see there that the rip fence and sliding table has adjustments for making angled cuts, which is great. Something to look for when you're shopping for a tile saw. The ability to make a few different types of cuts will just make your tool a little more versatile and be able to have the flexibility to make those cuts if and when you need them. All right, so let's get this table cleaned up. Logan's just using a chisel to scrape out everything that was left in the table. And again, this will just help the table slide through the saw nice and smooth. Then you can actually take this table off of the saw and use the hose to further clean it and just get it nice and clean. That's the easiest way to clean that up. So let's talk about the saw blade. So you're definitely going to want to be using a saw blade that is made for tile, and that is a diamond blade. And again, be sure you're using one that you can use for wet applications. Just do your research on the actual blade. Make sure that you're using the right blade for the job. We had a masonry blade on there before, and that's when we were cutting some pavers for our backyard. And then we're just switching it back into the tile blade since we're going to be cutting tile for this. You can see there the blade cabinet there, or chamber, kind of opens up, and then you can loosen the blade and tighten it as shown. All right, so now we've got the right blade in, our basin is full, and the table is nice and clean so it can move freely. So it's time to actually start cutting the tile. Now, cutting the tiles is relatively straightforward. Depending on your specific tile saw, you will either move the tile into the blade using your hands, or the table will move into the blade like we have here. So there are a few tricks to cutting tile with a wet tile saw to prevent chipping, which is always a concern. First, you want to mark your tile or just use the tape measure to line everything up as Logan did. And then the key with using a wet tile saw is to be aware of how fast you're cutting. And I am intentionally keeping this video, I'm not speeding it up at all. This is the exact speed that Logan was moving while he was cutting this tile, just so you can see that slow and steady really wins the race for a wet tile saw. Cutting your tiles slow is always going to be better than cutting too fast with a saw. So the slower you go, it's going to help prevent a lot of the chipping, and it really lets the blade do its work through cutting the tile. It gives it time to actually make the cut. So if you push the tile through too fast, your saw could overheat, and that will lead to tile chips. And then another thing that'll happen is it'll also make your blade dull over time if you're moving too fast and the blade is having to work kind of too hard. So it's intentional that you want to move nice and slow when you're operating your wet tile saw. So over the course of your project, you will notice that the water splashes up and over through the blade and onto the tile. And it can kind of get messy, and it'll splash out of the basin there. So you want to be sure to keep an eye on your water level in the basin and maintain the proper level. There's probably going to be a mark in your basin to show you where it's supposed to be at. So if the water gets too low, you're going to risk the saw overheating, and you don't want to do that. And that'll also cause chips in your tile. So be sure you keep the water filled up, keep an eye on that while you're cutting your tile. And then it's helpful to keep kind of a big trash bin nearby to put any trash cuts after you're all done, and just keep your area nice and clean and free of debris. And just continue making the cut here, pushing the tile all the way through, slow and steady. And when you're all done, you can, of course, turn off the tile saw. And then this is one of the reasons why we love working outside with the tile saw, is that it can be pretty dirty when you're all done, and you can just simply hose it off and keep on moving, where that's a little harder to do when you're inside. Something that will inevitably happen when you're using your wet tile saw is you will notice some chipping on the edge, like I just showed you on where your tile saw cuts. And it's completely normal, and it's pretty easy to fix. You just want to grab one of these tile sanding blocks. It's sometimes referred to as a rubbing stone or a sanding stone, and you just rub it along the edge of the cut, and it'll just smooth out any of those chips. All right, so here's our finished tiled entryway. That's what we were cutting the tile for this project. We have a whole separate tutorial all about how we did this, so feel free to check that out. And then here's the rest of our living room. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. And if you did, feel free to give it a big thumbs up, let us know in the comments, and then subscribe to our channel while you're here. We share weekly DIY and renovating videos just like this one. All right, see you next week. So if you're watching this video, you're probably either thinking about buying a new table saw, or your hand at your very first DIY project, DIY tile project.